Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar for the transition to ISO 22000-2018. So thank you for attending to this webinar today. And we are going to review some of the following points. So we are going to be checking key aspects introduced in the ISO 22000-2018 version. We'll talk about the new terms and concepts that this new version has brought. We also mentioned some new suggestions and also, of course, the new requirements to be applied, and also the transition timeline and how NQA can help you with this transition. So first of all, let's start from the beginning. So let's talk about the origin of ISO 22000. ISO 22000 was developed due to the need to facilitate the harmonization between different food safety regulations. So there were several food crises in the past that challenged the credibility of the food safety of the food industry. So as you may remember, for example, the mad cow disease back in the 80s, also adulteration of wines, adulteration of the mustard oil, and also a very sound crisis that happened in the States, for example, related to the outbreak of salmonellosis due to the contamination of ice cream. So apart from that, HACCP was also developed by Codex, and it became a legal requirement supported by the regulation 852 related to hygiene of foodstuff. But what happened? HACCP was not intended to be audited and the principles certified. So other HACCP standards came up, like, for example, the National Danish or the Dutch HACCP standard. So all of these, the need to really respond to the consumer needs, pushed the development of the ISO 22000-2005. So everyone was really excited about this. And of course, every ISO standard must have 5 years revision. So after 5 years, the committee must get together and they must review the standard. So what happened during this, after 5 years, so in 2010, it was reviewed, but it wasn't considered that needed any kind of change. So the industry was finding many challenges, and also the release in 2015 of other standards like the QMS standard, the environmental or the health and safety with the same structure as mandated by the directive Part 1 that required the same structure for all the management systems. All of this pushed the committee for the development of the ISO 2018 version. So they started to do this back in 2014, but it wasn't until June 2018 when the last version came up. So let's start for the main change that you are going to notice once you read the standard. So the main thing you are going to see is a change in the structure. So you are going to see that we had before 8 requirements for the standard, and now we have 10 requirements. So some of them are quite new. So the context of the organization, and also in planning, you will see addressing risks and opportunities. And in operations, we are going to see all the new requirements that were added into this part of into this version of the standard. So if you are already certified with any other standard like quality, environmental, you are going to be very familiar with these new requirements. But if you are only certified for ISO 22000, if your system is certified ISO 22000, then these new concepts will take some time to do it. So you need to be very thorough and review all your system, as we are going to be discussing today. So the standard has a specific introduction and annexes that highlight really the changes on process approach by combining risk-based thinking with the need of processes interaction. And it does it through 2 PDCA cycles. Apart from that, you will see also 2 new annexes. So Annex A, it refers to the cross-references between this version of the standard and the HACCP. And then in Annex B, you can see cross-references between the previous version and the 2018 version. So these are the 2 PDCA cycles that the standard talks about. So on the top, you can see the organizational level. So you can follow a PDCA cycle through the structure of the standard. But then there is another level, the operational level at the bottom, and it's all incorporated in the section of operations. So as you can see at the bottom, all the HACCP principles are going to be covered. Okay, so risk-based thinking must be considered through both levels. So obviously our approach must change. So risk-based thinking definitely must be addressed on these 2 levels. And what the standard says here is that every time that we consider new processes, new controls, or changes in our food safety management system, we really need to consider risk into decision making. So there is a new perspective when thinking on risk that we were not used to think on this before. So for example, before we were just thinking on risk based on the analysis of the function of probability and severity when identifying a food safety hazard. So now what the standard wants us to do is to look at the risk as well as those effects that can impact our system to get the intended goals. So to be honest, this concept has always been implicit in ISO 22000 as part of the preventive actions implemented by HACCP. But now the standard wants to emphasize the need to consider risk throughout the management system. So let's start now talking about all the requirements implemented in this version. So you will see now a scope doesn't really introduce any change with respect to the previous version of the standard, with the version 2005. So the only thing that we should highlight here is that the feed and animal food producers organizations have been mentioned. And this is because they are also part of those organizations to which the standard requirements apply. This technical specification, the 22002/6, was released in 2016, replacing the publicly available specification 222, as you may know. So from January 2018, all organizations within this sector must use the ISO 22002/6 technical specifications instead of the past 222. So the sections that this scope introduce are the purpose of the standard, types of organization that it's designed to apply to, and also the sections of the standard. No any other changes that we need to really highlight in comparison with the version 5. Normative references. So there are no normative references given in the ISO 20000/2018. In other words, no any other normative is considered as indispensable for the application of this standard. However, we really recommend you to have a look at these ISO family standards because they will help you with understanding the ISO 22000 requirements. So after this webinar today, we are going to send you a recording, the recording webinar, and also some of the documentation that we have developed to help you with the transition. So as part of the implementation guide, you will find this list, so you don't need to take notes right now. Okay, so you can have a look later, but I really recommend you to read all of these standards. So let's talk about the terms and definitions. So there are new terms and definitions, exactly 31 new, and 3 have been redefined. Obviously, we are not going to be talking about all the 31 new definitions, but we are going to highlight the ones that we consider more interested for you for the transition of this new version. So first of all, let's talk about the redefined concepts. So we have here critical control point. Of course, I'm going to be talking about CCPs and OPRPs because we all know that many people still get a struggle to know the difference between them. So critical control point in 2005 was considered as a step at which control can be applied and is essential to prevent or eliminate a food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. Well, now, as part of the version 2018, we have a CCP defined as a step in the process at which control measures are applied to prevent or reduce a significant food safety hazard to an acceptable level. So there are different concepts here that we didn't have before. So as you can see, a step in the process, this wasn't mentioned in the previous version, but if it wasn't clear enough, that was a step in the process, now it is, okay? So it must be a step in the process, okay, at which control measures are applied to prevent or reduce a significant food safety hazard. So now here you have another thing that you didn't have before. So it's prevention or reduction. We are not talking about elimination anymore. Okay, it is quite difficult to eliminate a food safety hazard, so we really need to talk about reduce it to an acceptable level that is appropriate for the consumption or for the use of the particular product. And if you see here as well, we are talking about significant food safety hazards. So before, when we were doing the risk assessment and we considered the higher score ones to implement measures, we didn't have a name for those. Now the version of the standard specifies that this must be called significant food safety hazards. And only for the significant ones, we are going to apply control measures. Okay, so you may still have controls for other safety hazards, but they are not going to be called control measures, okay, because they are not going to be in place for significant food safety hazards. So for example, when before we had control points, so still we have to control it somehow, but you cannot really call it control measure, okay? So you can just say controls or measures or whatever you want to call it, okay? And we have as well undefined critical limits and measurement enable the application of corrections. So now when we review the definition of OPRP and later on we are going to compare both of them, you are going to understand this end of the definition. So for OPRP, so before we consider the OPRP as a prerequisite identified by the hazard analysis as essential in order to control the probability of introducing food safety hazards. Okay. What happened now in the version 2018? So it's not an essential prerequisite as we always considered before. So now it is a control measure or combination of control measures that must be applied to prevent or reduce, again, a significant food safety hazard to an acceptable level. So we are not saying that it's a prerequisite. We are saying that it's a control measure. It could be in the process or not. It's not specified, so it could be in the process. And where action criterion, we didn't have this knowledge before of this point. A measurement or observation enable effective control of the process and or product. So as you remember before, when we have the OPRP, so we have to implement these control measures and we have to monitor them through the implementation of any kind of measure or observation, as it says clearly here. Well, now to that particular measure that you implement, for monitoring this OPRP, you are going to call it action criteria. And the main thing here is that this can be measurable, but also observable. And it wasn't clarified before. So everything that you consider, for example, if you think about a filter or any other control that you may have in place that can be monitored by an observation, it will be an operational prerequisite, okay? We are not gonna say that it's a critical control point anymore because it can be monitored by an observation and doesn't need any kind of measurement, like for example, pH or temperature or time, okay? And again here, we applied control measures to reduce or prevent significant food safety hazards. So the same done for the CCPs. So there are other, there is just one redefined term that is monitoring. So I just want to talk about these three because now they are quite clear, and so there is no need for confusion for anyone for understanding the concept of validation and verification. So validation is obtaining evidence that a control measure will be capable of effectively controlling the significant food safety hazard. So what we are doing when validating, we are just checking if in the future our activity is going to work, our control that we put in place is working, so our process is going to be safe. Okay, so it's kind of a future assessment. By monitoring, we are determining the status of a system, a process, or an activity. It's quite clear now. It's a bit shorter, that definition. So now it's a present assessment. Let's say like you are doing the activity right now, so you are just checking it now to make sure that it's working. And verification is the confirmation through the provision of objective evidence that the specified requirements have been fulfilled. So this means that you are doing an assessment of the past. So once the activity has been done, so you are checking just to make sure that it works as you were planning, okay? So monitoring, CCP, and OPRP were redefined, and also 31 new terms are included now in the standard, in this version. So we have action criteria. As we said, it's action criterion or action criteria. It's measurable or observable specification for the monitoring of operational prerequisite. Significant food safety hazard. Food safety hazard identified through the hazard assessment, which needs to be controlled by control measures. Only control measures for significant food safety hazards. And what is these control measures? What are they? Are actions or activities that are essential to prevent a significant food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. We are not talking about elimination anymore in this version of the standard. We're not even talking about HACCP, as you will see. HACCP is only mentioned once or twice in the part of the section 8. So we are more focused now on prevention and then the analysis of the risk throughout the whole management system. Other definitions that I want to highlight today are, for example, the acceptable level is the level of a food safety hazard not to be exceeded in the end product provided by the organization. Outsource, we'll talk about this later on in section 8. It's making an arrangement when an external organization performs part of the functions or processes within your organization. And then we have also interested parties. Get familiar with this term because this is a person or organization that can be affected or can affect or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. Okay. We are not talking about customers anymore. We are talking about interested parties, but we'll discuss this later on. So, just to compare the definitions of CCP and OPRP. So, CCP is now a step in the process. OPRP is a control measure or a combination of control measures. It can be in the process or not. The CCP must be in the process. For the monitoring of CCPs, we have critical limits that must be measurable. For the monitoring of OPRPs, we have an action criteria or action criterion that must be measurable or observable. Okay, so this is a good difference when discussing with your team what are you going to consider that point. Okay, if it's observable only, then it's going to be an OPRP. And the CCP will enable the application of corrections, whereas the OPRP will enable the effective control of the process or product. So maybe this is not clear enough if you see it from this comparison here, but when we were talking about Section 8, exactly in the 8.9, the standard tells us what to do when the critical limits or the action criteria are not met. So you will understand much better the definition of these CCPs and OPRPs when we get to that section later on. So let's talk about now the auditable requirements of the standard. So when the auditor gets to the premises, so he's gonna be reviewing these sections from 4 to 10. So we have a new requirement now is the understanding of the organization context. So what is this? How could your business be affected? So what we need to think here is that top management usually is the one that gathers all this information throughout all different levels of the organizations. So it implies an analysis of the internal and also external issues that can affect the capability of the management system to get the intended results. Okay, so we also must bear in mind that these issues can be positive or negative, but you still need to consider them to define the context. And once you have defined the context, then you can set the food safety objectives. So as you can see here, there are some examples. Obviously, you will need to use different kind of methodologies to get the external and internal issues that may impact your management system to get the goals. So for example, you can use the SWOT analysis. You know that through the analysis of the strengths and weaknesses, you can actually get the internal issues of your organization. And also by analyzing the opportunities and threats, you will get the external issues that may impact your management system. The version 2018 doesn't really specify any kind of methodology to be used. So you can use anyone that you consider that is thorough enough to give you all these issues that can really affect the business. Also, you can use the PSL analysis. So by checking political, economical, social, technological, also the legal and environmental issues, you will get all these external issues that they may impact the system. So bear in mind here that the standard doesn't really require this to be documented, but anyway, this is going to be very useful for the auditor when he goes to the, well, she goes to the premises and check how your system complies with the new requirements of the standard. So this will also demonstrate that you really understand and you have done this analysis of the issues. So you can do it. You can have, for example, documented information like about meeting minutes of this. How do you gather the information with the team? You can have maybe data analysis, graphics, everything that shows that you really had studied these issues that may affect the system. Okay. So this is a new requirement. And then we have another one as part of Section 4. So as I said before, we are not talking about customers anymore. We are talking about interested parties. So this section requires the determination of these interested parties that can influence the food safety management system in a positive or in a negative way. Okay, once you really have decided the interested parties that may affect the business, then you need to address their needs and expectations. Okay, some of them, for example, can be mandatory and incorporated into law. So anyway, you will have to consider them. So Interested parties, who are they? So of course, every single organization will have their specific interested parties and their specific needs and expectations. So that's why this is required to be quite specific for every organization and must be specific to your activities. So you may have, for example, regulators, of course, customers, consumers, workers, we cannot forget them. Also take into account your competitors, also distributors, suppliers that they are going to call in a different way through this version, that they are considered like external providers. Still the same, okay? So all of these internal interested parties can really affect or be affected by your system, so you need to consider all of them. So section 4 is sequential. So once you have determined the context, once you have defined our interested parties and their needs and expectations, then you can determine the scope of the food safety management system. So the standard requires here that you shall determine the boundaries and the applicability of the food safety management system. So it hasn't changed that much with respect to the previous version. The only thing that says here when determining the scope is just you need to take into account the physical and also geographical site within which your operations take place. So must be very specific to your activities or where the business is located. Products and services included in the food safety management system, the relevant parties you have identified, and special characteristics. So what is that? So for example, let's say the type of packaging that you are using, or for example, the shelf life conditions of your products, or the storage conditions. So you need to really take into consideration these points in order to determine the scope of the food safety management system. And once you have established all of this, then you can establish, you can implement, maintain, and continually improve a food safety management system. So the standard here tell us that we need to control and we need to determine processes and their interactions in order to get the intended results according to the food safety policy and also according to the strategic direction of your organization, okay? Obviously, all this information with regard to determining the scope of the food safety management system must be documented. So if you don't have it documented, then you may see a nonconformity. Well, you may not. You will see a nonconformity raised by an auditor. So make sure that you document the scope of the food safety management system. Okay, so we finished with section 4. We are going to continue reviewing the following sections of the standard. So leadership, section 5. So the previous version 2005 already mentioned how top management can demonstrate leadership and commitment. So they can do it through, for example, establishing the food safety policy, or they can do it through sufficient resources provided for the activities, or even by leading the management review meetings. So version 2018 also indicates that top management shall ensure the strategic plans and objectives are compatible and integrated within the organization. They should also ensure that integration of the food safety management system requirements into the business processes. So I'm just highlighting here the differences with the previous version 5. So other things will be taken into account. So we're here just to highlight the changes, okay? Then top management as well must approve the food safety policy. And this food safety policy must be appropriate to the purpose and context of the organization. In the food safety policy, there must be a framework for setting and reviewing the objectives. The food safety policy must satisfy applicable food safety requirements and also customer requirements and statutory requirements, address internal and external communication, It must set a commitment for continual improvement and must ensure competencies related to food safety. And we cannot forget the food safety policy must be retained as a documented information. So top management commitment with respect to the food safety management system must be visible and palpable. So a good way to do this, for example, is just to communicate well the food safety policy. And you can do it, for example, through the induction packs that you give to your employees. You can do it through the contracts that you may have with external providers or suppliers, as we used to call them. Also, for example, hanging the food safety policy through the notice boards, or by displaying the food safety policy through the website. So there are different ways, but the most important is that this has to be visible, okay? So once you have established the food safety policy, this must be communicated to all interested parties. Don't forget to do this, okay? This would be another non-conformity. You don't do that because it's another requirement of the standard. So periodically, the food safety policy must be reviewed by top management, ensuring that it remains applicable to the context of the organization. Other things that top management must do, for example, they need to assign the roles, responsibilities, and authorities. So these responsibilities and authorities, they must be assigned, but also understood. So by responsibilities, we are talking about what is expected from the employee, okay? By authority, we are talking about what they are allowed to do. Where are the limits? So you need to establish the limits, and they need to be clear. They need to be understood by the employees. How can you do this? You can have an organigram, for example, in your organization, or you can show this by the job descriptions, for example, where you have defined the duties and also the authorities for each role. The standard also specifies that there must be a nominated food safety team leader with authority to manage the system, to ensure the work is managed, as well as the training and competencies of the food safety team. Also, authority to report on the effectiveness and suitability of the food safety management system, and authority also to make continual improvements as determined by top management. So, we have reviewed the main changes that are incorporated into this section 5. So let's talk now about a new requirement introduced in section 6 that is all about planning. So we have 6.1 as a new requirement that talks about actions to address risk and opportunities. So what is this? Okay, so in this section, what you really need to do is that you really need to ask yourself, what are you trying to achieve? Okay, what can interfere to stop achieving your objectives? How then can risk be turned into opportunities? How can opportunities help us to improve? So all these questions must be considered here. And if you have done before what we were talking about the context of the organization, defining the context, and also identifying the interested parties and their needs and expectations, then this part will be easier, okay? Because you will have all these issues that may affect the system. So the risk and opportunities will be an easy point if you really have gone thoroughly through section 4. So ISO 13000 differentiates between two types of risk management. The one that focuses just on the operational level and can be controlled through the establishment and maintenance of PRPs, or the CCPs, of the prerequisites, and also by establishing a good emergency preparedness and response procedure, for example. But also consider risk that may affect the entire management system and could make an impact into food safety. Okay, so we need to think on those risks as well. So you really need to have an action plan. You need to have an action plan specifying what is going to be done, what resources do you have, who is going to be responsible for those actions, when the actions will be done, and how the results will be evaluated. Okay? So now we are going to talk about 6.2 and 6.3, differences with the previous version of the standard. So here we have the food safety objectives. So the food safety objectives must be, as we mentioned before in the previous version of the standard, must be consistent with the food safety policy, must be measurable, consistent with applicable food safety requirements, must be monitored and verified, must be communicated. So, for example, through induction induction training, or displaying the food safety objectives around your premises, for example. They must be maintained and updated, and of course, always documented. Okay, so you can use, for example, the SMART term in order to guide you for the establishment of these food safety objectives. And once you have, for example, once you have the food safety objective set, if there is any kind of change in your organization, you must maintain the integrity of the food safety management system. So you really need to consider all these changes in order to then conduct a revision of the food safety management system and ensure that it's still working as expected. About section 7. So we have gone through all previous versions of the standard, the auditable ones, the section 4 to 6. Now we are going to be talking about resources, about competence, awareness, communication, and also documentation for the food safety management system. These will all make sure that the system runs effectively, okay? So first of all, what we need to consider here. So version 2018 states that we need to evaluate, first of all, if we have resources for our activities. Then, are they sufficient? Do you need external resources? So this is first what you need to consider for the activities, okay? And then we are going to be talking about all of these changes introduced in the different requirements of this section. So for example, we have for people, we need to ensure that they are competent, including outsource. What the standard says here. So in here, the standard talks about the external experts that we may use to develop documentation, or maybe for the operations part of our system. So all those external experts, we really need to have in place an agreement or a contract, must be obviously documented, that demonstrate as well that they are competent. We need to have defined the responsibilities and also the authorities. So not only our employees must be competent, also this external personnel that we may use to develop our system. Infrastructure. So we need to consider how to provide and maintain the needs for every area. So this is quite straight to the point. So you can demonstrate this part of this requirement, that you are in compliance with this requirement by, for example, showing to the auditor a list of all the equipment that you need to use for the activities, also maintenance planning of the premises and also the equipment, or through the maintenance records, resource planning, so that there are different ways to demonstrate that you are in compliance with this requirement of the standard. Work environment. The version 2018 specifies that we need to ensure that you have the right atmosphere that enables personnel to operate effectively. So what he's talking about? He's talking about, for example, adequate light, adequate heat, airflow, also, for example, the noise levels. You can also include here stress reduction, for example, everything that is going to make your employees to work in an effective manner, okay? And here we have two new requirements. First of all, we have externally developed elements of the food safety management system. The standard says we need to ensure all externally developed devices are adapted to processes and updated. And we need to maintain documented information. So what the standard says here, what are these? So we can consider, like for example, the software that we may use for the monitoring of those CCPs or PRPs, for example. So this software needs to be specific to our activities, so need to be adjusted to our organization. Okay, so we need to make sure that all external developed elements must be specific for our business and activities. Also, for example, if you have hired a consultant for the development of some part of the documentation, makes you feel better, comfortable, or give you the competence required to do so, then that developed documentation must be really adapted, to your business, to the processes, to the activities that you are carrying out every day. Okay. So externally developed elements of the food safety management system, new requirements, and now also control of externally provided services, products, or processes. As we said before, we are not talking about suppliers, we are talking about external providers. So the standards here says that we need to evaluate and even reevaluate, communicate, and monitor all these external providers of services, products, or processes. And we need to maintain documented information to demonstrate compliance. So who are those? So for example, for external provided services, we may consider, for example, the contract cleaning that we may have. We can consider also here, for example, the pest control that is conducted by an external organization. We can also consider here, for example, external cleaning, so the contract cleaning that you may have, and also, for example, the contract laundry for your garments can be considered as external provided services. But what the standard means by external provided processes? So this could be part of the processes of your organization. So for example, if external supplier or provider is doing part of your activities, like for example, labeling, or maybe sorting raw materials, or doing irradiation, or packaging, so then they are considered external providers of processes, and you need to evaluate them, and you need to communicate your specific requirements, and you need to monitor them. Okay, you need to keep documented information that demonstrates that you are doing so. Okay, so now we are gonna go through the last part of this section that talks about competence. So as we mentioned before, and the standard repeats also here, not only personnel, but also external providers need to be competent. So competence here, in this version of the standard, has been defined as the ability to apply knowledge and skills. So it's not just to have the training, so they need to demonstrate that can really apply that training. Okay. Also, personnel controlling critical operations, they must be competent to do so. So by critical operations, we say, for example, the monitoring or maybe the verification of the CCPs or the OPRPs, just to verify that they are under control. So this personnel must be competent to do these activities, and you need to demonstrate that. Awareness. Version 2018 specifies that what personnel needs to be aware of, like, for example, the policy, the objectives, their contribution to the food safety management system, for example, including the benefits of the improved performance. So they need to be aware of all these points, and this has been detailed now in the new version of the standard. Communication and documented information, they haven't really changed if we compare them with the previous version, with 2005. Communication, we are going to find the same information. The only thing that has changed are two terms, the one regarding qualifications that has been replaced by competence, and also the term of suppliers, as I said several times, now they are called external providers. And same thing for documented information, but the only thing that I want to highlight here as well is that you need to include as documented information all those customer requirements, all those statutory and regulatory requirements that apply to your organization, okay? So you need to keep them as documented information, and this is a new requirement of the standard that you need to consider. Okay. We are done now with section 7. So if you see that I am a bit speedy, it's because I want to review all the new requirements of the standard, okay? And all the new changes. So let's start by this section 8. In this section, we are going to cover all the hazard principles. So we are going to see that most of them, except, for example, the food safety team, that is going to be part of the section 5, but the rest are going to be included in that part, in this part. 8.1, this is a new requirement. And I have specified here that it's a common requirement. What that means? So in every other ISO standard, like for example, the 9001, 14,001, 45,001, you are going to find this common requirement. But the other parts, the other requirements of this section are just specific for ISO 20000, and they don't have anything to do with the other standards, okay? So 8.1, that is a common requirement, specifies that all the controls that you have planned before, they need to be in place now. And you need to have documented evidence to demonstrate that you are acting as planned. Okay, so you need to ensure that all the requirements are understood by establishing criteria for processes, by implementing controls of these processes, and also determining the ability to comply with the requirements. 8.2 talks about prerequisite programs. So in this part, what is new? So the standard tells us to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are now considered when selecting and establishing the prerequisite programs. So you need to consider them when establishing the prerequisites in your organization. Also, the standard mentioned before the technical specifications, the 22002 series, but now version 2018 suggests the use of this series for establishing the prerequisite programs within your business. So as you may know, there are 5 technical specifications right now. So we have a technical specification for manufacturing, we have another one for food packaging materials, farming, catering, okay? So and we have the other one, of course, that was recently released for feed and food animal producers. There is another one that is being reviewed right now that is about transport and storage, but will be hopefully released soon. So all of them, and obviously the one that applies to the business is now suggested to be used when establishing the prerequisite programs. So have a look, read it, and consider what is specified in this technical specification. Also, new aspects shall be considered when establishing the prerequisite programs. You need to consider now the receiving incoming materials, storage, dispatch, transportation and handling, and also product information and consumer awareness. So labeling must be also considered when establishing the prerequisite programs. Okay, let's review now traceability and emergency preparedness. So for traceability, there are further aspects to be considered. So we have the relation of lots of received materials, also the ingredients and intermediate products to the end products. These need to be considered when doing your traceability exercise. Also, reworking of materials and products. So this has to be also considered, and it's being specified in version 2018. You need to also ensure applicable legal and customer requirements are identified. And also time to maintain records has been specified by this version. So you need to maintain these records for about the same shelf life of the product, so no less than that. Okay, and then you need to also check the effectiveness of the traceability system. So this has to be tested. Same for emergency preparedness and response. So now the standard has specified all the steps to handle these emergencies. As emergency situations, you could consider, for example, natural disasters, an earthquake, or depending on the area, of course, this can happen. Also sabotage, blockage of main utilities, environmental accidents, or all of those can be considered for emergency preparedness and response. But now the standard also tells us that we need to test it. So we have specified in the standard that we need to test traceability system, we need to test emergency preparedness and response, and also don't forget recall or withdrawal, okay? So all of these must be tested to ensure the effectiveness of the procedure that we have implemented. Okay, so we are now in 8.5 requirement. So there are many, not many, but there are some changes here that I want to highlight. This is a long section of the standard, so we are just going to mention just the changes in comparison with the version 2005. So here you're going to find all the hazard principles developed by Codex. Okay, this is the part what we are talking about hazard, and where the standard really talks about hazard. We haven't read hazard before when reviewing the rest of the documentation. So the standard says now that the characteristics of raw materials, ingredients, and product contact materials, we need to also identify the source of the products. So it's not just only detailing the origin, the country of origin of the products, we need to also specify the source. So for example, when we are talking about gelatin or any other product, we need to specify if it's coming from animal, from plants, or maybe another ingredient. We need to also specify this coming from minerals, okay? So these need to be detailed in the raw materials specifications. End products. We need to also specify the method of delivery, not just the method of distribution, but also delivery of those products. Description of processes and process environment. So before, the standard only says description of processes. Now also mentions process environment to be considered here. And what it does is also specified all descriptions that you must have documented. So have a look at this section, okay, because describe all of these processes that you need to have documented, including the process environment. Flow diagrams, we need to include more details. So we need to include where the processing aids, packaging, and for example, utilities are entering as part of our flow diagram, as part of our process. So we need to detail that in our flow diagrams. Don't forget it, because that's a new requirement. Also about hazard identification in relation to type of product, process, and process environment. So in this section, the standard said that we need to be more specific. So when we are identifying hazards, we cannot just say like, oh, growth of pathogens and move on. No, you need to really define what kind of pathogens can grow. Okay, so the auditor will expect to see a thorough assessment now where the particular, for example, in this example, the pathogens, which kind of pathogens, depending on the product, depending on the process, can grow, and you need to really conduct a thorough assessment, but this will enable as well that the hazard assessment is going to be more professional, and it's going to be, you are going to see also that the control measures are appropriate, okay? So a thorough identification will enable the appropriate control measures. Also, it's specified here that you can use internal information from your organization. The experience can tell you this when identifying hazards, and also you can use customer requirements as another source for identifying hazards. We have then selection of control measures point. So the standards tell us here that we need to consider the viability of measurable critical limits and corrections in case of failure. And we need to also consider external requirements that may affect, for example, the selection of the control measures that need to be maintained as documented information. Okay. So these control measures that you have implemented to control the hazards analysis must be validated. And this has to be done prior to the hazard control plan implementation. And you must be thinking, but what is a hazard control plan? I never heard of this. So the standard now specifies hazard control plan for the hazard plan and the monitoring system for the CCPs, and also for the OPRP plan and monitoring systems for OPRPs. So before, we only have to have documented a hazard plan. Now the standard talks about an OPRP plan as well. So if you have identified OPRPs, you must have an OPRP plan. Okay, so this is what is called hazard control plan. And prior to the implementation of this, you need to validate all the control measures. Obviously, this has to be documented, so don't forget to document the hazard control plan, okay, to demonstrate compliance with respect to this requirement. So once the PRPs, the hazard control plan is established, we need to review the raw materials characteristics, also the end product specifications, the flow diagram, and the intended use, and we need to consider if it's still valid. If there is any kind of change, then we need to revise and update the PRPs and the hazard control plan, okay? That's what is mentioned as part of the 8.6 requirement. And to finish with this section, we are going to be talking about control of monitoring and measuring. So do you remember when we were talking before about these externally developed elements of the management system? So here the standard specifies that the software used for monitoring and measuring needs validation. So it's not only that it has to be adapted to the organization and also the processes and the activities. This has to be validated. So you need to make sure any software that you use externally, this has to be validated. Also, verification related to PRPs and the hazard control plan. You need to confirm the effectiveness of the PRPs and the hazard control plan. Remember, OPRP plan and hazard plan. And then verification and monitoring of the activities of control measures by different personnel. What that means. So if you have one person doing verification and also monitoring of OPRPs and CCPs, that's no longer valid, that's no longer acceptable. So you need to assign the responsibilities of monitoring these CCPs and OPRPs and also the verification of these monitoring activities to two different employees, okay? And then section 8.9 also specifies that when you have, for example, your non-conformity log, you need to also consider customer complaints and regulatory findings. So the consumer complaints must be considered here, so you need to follow them up and you need to implement the appropriate corrections and also corrective actions. So you remember when we were talking about the CCPs and the OPRPs, and we said, well, let's review the last part of the definition later on in section 8.9 because it's going to be more clear to you. So the standard says that the CCP will enable, so these control measures that we implement for the CCP will enable the implementation of corrections. So in this section of the standard, it is specified that when the critical limits are not met, so we need to identify those products as potentially unsafe products, and we cannot release them. Okay, especially we need to maintain them in the floor. I mean, in production floor, we cannot release these products under no circumstances. So we can't release this product. They only can be reprocessed, they can be destroyed, or they can be used, they can be given another use that doesn't jeopardize food safety in the food chain. So if critical limits are not met, we don't release them. Potentially unsafe, we identify them, and then we have three options: reprocess, destroy them, or other use. For action criteria, the standard gives more options, so it's a bit more open with regard to the action criteria. I'm not really, I don't really agree with this because it should be the same kind of strictness for the OPRPs, but the standard says so, so we need to comply with this. So action criteria, when the action criteria are not met, remember, this is the monitoring activities that we have implemented for the OPRPs. Then what we have to do? We have to determine the consequence of that failure with respect to food safety. And we have to determine the cause of this failure and also identify the affected products and conduct a release evaluation. Okay, so we have different options. It's a bit more open to an interpretation, to a study. So this release evaluation gives you also other options that you need to document, of course, to demonstrate that you are really controlling the process. As we said before, CCP, as you can see on the top, enable corrections. In the OPRP case, we are enable the control of the process or processes by doing this kind of analysis. So when doing the release evaluation, what are we doing? We are checking if there is any other evidence that demonstrates that the control measures were effective. So if you have that, document it. Then we can consider that other control measures, the combination of these control measures, make the product suitable. Or maybe other activities can demonstrate conformity. Okay, other verification activities can demonstrate conformity with this acceptable level. So we have different options, and this is going to enable the control of the product processes. So as you can see here, now the definition makes sense. Monitoring for the critical limits, enable corrections. Monitoring for the action criteria, enable the control of the product and processes. And obviously, as I mentioned before, have it documented. As you know, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Okay, we have reviewed section 8, the big part about HACCP, and about the whole operations, the core operations of ISO 23000. And then we have here performance evaluation. So 9.1 is also a new requirement. So what is saying here is what shall be determined. So we need to consider what is going to be monitored and measured, how it's going to be monitored, measured, analyzed, and evaluated, when are these activities conducted, when the results shall be analyzed and evaluated, and who should analyze and evaluate them. So we need to have all of this into consideration for monitoring and measurement analysis and evaluation requirement. Also, we need to keep documented information as evidence of these results. And we need to also consider the performance and effectiveness of the food safety management system. As internal audits, what the standard specifies here. So with respect to the previous version, we need to have an audit program as we mentioned before. But in this program, we need to also consider changes in the food safety management system, results of monitoring and measurement, and also results from previous internal audits. Also, as part of this section, what this version of the standard says is that the results must be reported to the food safety team and top management. And we need to determine if the food safety management system meets the intent of the food safety policy and objectives through these internal audits, okay? Management review. Management review, if you have already read the standard, so you are going to see that there are no changes with regard to the output of the management review. So everything will be, the same information must be included as part of the output, but as part of the input, what needs to be discussed in management review, several points has been introduced in this section. So you have to discuss now changes in internal and external issues that may affect the food safety management system, including changes in the organization and context. As you can see, this was a new requirement introduced as part of this version, so that's why now needs to be really considered as part of this point. Also, information on the performance and effectiveness of the food safety management system, including trends in review of identified risks and opportunities, and effectiveness of actions taken, again, a new requirement. Performance of providers of services, processes, or products. Remember that, for example, the pest control company that does these activities for us, or the cleaning company that we have externalized for doing these activities, or if another external organization is doing the labeling for us, we need to really check their performance, okay? And we need to discuss this during the management review meeting. Non-conformities and corrective actions, monitoring and measuring results, whether the objectives have been achieved, and also we need to consider in these meetings the adequacy of resources that we have from top management. Are they sufficient? Also, opportunities for continual improvement, okay? If we have found more opportunities, we need to really discuss this during the management review meeting. So, requirements specified in section 10. So 10.1 is a new requirement of the standard. So here basically is not very difficult, this part, because the standard just says the steps that we need to follow when a non-conformity occurs. So we need to react to the non-conformity. We need to evaluate the need for action to eliminate the cause of the non-conformity. We need to implement any action needed. We need to review the effectiveness of any correction action taken, and we need to make changes to the food safety management system if necessary. So this is really something that we obviously knew before, but now has been detailed to make sure that you are not missing any point. Okay. For continual improvement, so there are no significant changes here. But just to highlight the importance of improving suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the food safety management system. So what the standard says here is that if all previous sections were established and implemented, as well as the food safety management system have been updated, then continual improvement will occur, okay? And the last point, updating the food safety management system. This hasn't changed at all. So there is the same information, version 2005 in 2018. So here, top management must provide resources, food safety team leader must evaluate the food safety management system, and at planned intervals. Also, all of these will maintain the management system. We need to maintain all this documented information, and also we need to discuss any kind of changes, any kind of update during the management review meetings. So just to highlight now, we just reviewed all the new requirements of the 2018 version. So we are going to talk about the transition timeline. So the standard was published in June 2018. You have 3 years from the day the standard was published to do the transition to the new version 2018. Okay, so you have until 18th of June 2021 to do your transition audit. So we encourage all our clients to do a transition and complete also a gap analysis that we are gonna give them before this audit is confirmed. So the last day to schedule any transition audits will be in April 2021, and then the transition period ends in June 2021. Okay, remember that day, 18th of June 2021. So how can NQA help you with the transition? So to all our clients, we are going to provide a transition gap analysis, and this has to be filled out. When the auditor goes there, the auditor is going to see if the organization has implemented all the changes because they really need to highlight how they have done it. Okay. Also, we can do a pre-assessment audit if the organization needs that. So, for example, this is not going to be part of the certification cycle, so it's going to be like a special visit, but the auditor will go there to see if you have implemented all the changes, and some non-conformities will be raised if you haven't done it, okay? So a pre-assessment. Also, we have a gap guide and an implementation guide already available in our website. So you can go now after attending to this webinar, download all the documents, or we also are going to send you all this information with the recording webinar. Okay, so just for you to know that this is also going to be available at the website. So transition can be done at surveillance visit and also at recertification. There is going to be another ISO 22000-2018 webinar in the future, and you can also see in our website some news and blog related to these changes that may help you with the transition. So now I went slightly over the time required for this webinar. So it's time now for all the questions that you may have. As said before, you can really have all these recording webinar later on. We are going to send you as well a test. You can complete the test, and you are going to get a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So I'm going to check now if there are any questions regarding to the transition requirements. Is the recording sent as well as slides afterwards? Yes. Thank you so much for the feedback. Okay, there are no any questions, so I hope that means that you understood everything. So we are going to finish the webinar now, so thank you so much for attending. I appreciate that. If you have any questions, you can always contact us. Thank you for attending.